The coastal town was a picture of serenity. Gentle waves kissed the shore with a rhythm as old as time itself, while the sun bathed everything in golden light. Fishermen, with their weathered faces and calloused hands, prepared their boats for the evening's catch, their laughter and stories drifting through the air like a warm breeze. Among them was Dani, a man whose rugged good looks and steady demeanor made him stand out from the rest. With strong arms honed by years of hard work and eyes that glimmered with quiet strength, Dani was a man of few words but boundless integrity. On the other side of town, in stark contrast to the simplicity of Dani's life, stood the lavish mansion of Emily, a woman whose world couldn't have been more different. Emily was the epitome of grace and sophistication, raised in a life of privilege, surrounded by luxury and opulence. Her father, a wealthy businessman, had ensured that Emily wanted for nothing, except perhaps the freedom to live life on her own terms. Her world was defined by the walls of high society, expectations, and decorum, a gilded cage that, despite its beauty, often left her feeling trapped. On this particular day, Emily's life was set on a course she never anticipated. Tired of the endless social obligations and feeling suffocated by her family's expectations, she decided to escape for a brief moment of solitude. She had always been drawn to the ocean, finding peace in its vastness, and so she impulsively drove to a remote part of the coast, far from the familiar beaches she frequented with her social circle. She longed for something different, something real. Dani, meanwhile, had just returned from a successful morning of fishing. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows on the beach as he unloaded his boat. His life, though hard, was simple, and he was content with it. But on this particular day, his routine was about to be disrupted in a way he never expected. As Emily wandered along the shoreline, her flowing dress billowed in the wind. She had discarded her high heels, letting her bare feet sink into the warm sand. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt free, untethered from the expectations of her family and the suffocating formality of her life. She walked with no destination in mind, her thoughts lost in the horizon, when she stumbled upon Dani. The first sight of him startled her. She wasn't used to seeing men like Dani, rugged, unrefined, and unapologetically masculine. His muscular frame, bronzed by the sun, was a stark contrast to the clean-cut, suited men she was used to in her social circle. Dani, too, was surprised by the sight of Emily. Her delicate, refined appearance stood out in the rugged landscape of the beach. Her porcelain skin and elegant dress were completely out of place, yet there was something about her that intrigued him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Emily felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite place. Was it attraction? Curiosity? Dani, on the other hand, saw in Emily a woman who seemed out of his league, but was also a mystery he wanted to unravel. "Excuse me." Emily finally spoke, her voice soft yet tinged with the confidence of someone used to getting what she wanted. "Do you know how far it is to the nearest road?" Dani paused for a moment before responding, his deep voice steady and calm. "Not far, but it's a rough walk if you're not used to it." Emily looked down at her dress. Realizing how impractical, she looked in the middle of the sand with no shoes and her designer clothes. A wave of embarrassment washed over her, but she quickly brushed it aside. "I suppose I'm not exactly dressed for the occasion," she said with a small, self-deprecating laugh. Dani smirked, his rough demeanor softening for a moment. "You could say that. This isn't exactly the place for fancy dresses." There was a brief pause, the air thick with the tension of two people from completely different worlds colliding. Emily, despite herself, found Dani's bluntness refreshing. He wasn't trying to impress her, nor was he treating her like the fragile socialite she had always been seen as. "I'm Emily," she said, offering her hand out of habit, though it felt strangely formal in the casual beach setting. Dani wiped his hands on his worn jeans before taking hers. "Dani," he said simply. Their handshake was brief, but in that moment, Emily felt a connection, something deeper than just politeness. Dani's hand was rough and calloused, a stark contrast to the soft hands of the men she was used to, and it made her wonder about the kind of life he led. "I come here to think," she said, looking out at the ocean, breaking the silence between them. Dani raised an eyebrow, slightly amused. "You picked a good spot for it." Emily smiled, feeling a little more at ease. "It's different. Quiet." Dani nodded, his gaze following hers to the horizon. "The sea has a way of clearing your head. Gives you perspective." For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like someone understood her. She had spent so much of her life surrounded by people who never truly saw her for who she was. They saw the wealthy heiress, the perfect daughter, the woman who was destined to marry someone from a similarly high-status family. But here, standing beside a man who knew nothing of her world, she felt seen. Their conversation continued, moving from small talk about the beach to more personal topics. Emily found herself opening up in a way she hadn't before. She told Dani about her frustrations with her family's expectations, her longing for something more meaningful in life. Dani listened quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. He wasn't one to talk much, but when he did, his words carried weight. "You don't have to live the life they expect of you," Dani said after a while, his voice low but firm. Emily looked at him, her heart beating faster. "It's not that simple." Dani shrugged, his expression serious. "It's as simple as you make it. You have a choice." Emily was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. So direct, so unafraid to challenge her. In that moment, she realized that Dani wasn't just some simple fisherman. He was someone who lived life on his own terms, and there was something incredibly freeing about that. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, orange glow over the beach, Emily felt a pang of sadness. She knew she had to return to her world, but part of her didn't want to leave. Part of her wanted to stay here, in this quiet place, with Dani and the simplicity of it all. "I should go," she said softly, breaking the peaceful silence between them. Dani nodded, but there was something in his eyes that told her he didn't want her to leave either. "I'll walk you back." The walk back to the road was quiet, but it wasn't awkward. There was a comfortable silence between them, as if they had known each other longer than just a few hours. When they reached the edge of the beach where Emily had parked her car, she turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Dani nodded, his gaze steady. "Anytime." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She knew she would see him again, though she wasn't sure how or when. But as she drove away, the image of Dani, standing on the beach, silhouetted against the fading sun, stayed with her. For the first time in her life, Emily felt like she had met someone who saw her for who she truly was. Not the heiress, not the socialite, but just Emily. And for Dani, as he watched her car disappear down the road, he couldn't help but wonder if his quiet, simple life was about to get a lot more complicated. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange. It had been several days since Emily and Dani's first encounter on the beach, yet neither of them could shake the thought of the other. For Emily, Dani represented something completely foreign and exciting, an escape from the confines of her suffocating life. For Dani, Emily was like a breath of fresh air, though he couldn't quite figure out why she had made such an impact on him. Their worlds couldn't have been more different, yet their thoughts kept circling back to one another. Emily, back in the opulence of her family's sprawling mansion, found herself feeling increasingly disconnected from her surroundings. Her father, a powerful businessman, spent most of his time engrossed in work, and her mother was preoccupied with maintaining their family's social standing. Emily had always been the obedient daughter, attending lavish parties, rubbing elbows with influential people, and being the picture of grace and poise. But lately, it all felt hollow. The grandeur that once excited her now felt like a burden, and she found herself daydreaming about the beach and Dani, the simple fisherman whose eyes seemed to see right through her, straight into her soul. That night, at another high society dinner, Emily sat at the long, ornate table, surrounded by finely dressed guests. The clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation, and the perfectly curated elegance of the evening only heightened her sense of isolation. Across from her sat Peter, a man her parents had been pushing her to consider. Peter was tall, well-dressed, and successful, everything her parents wanted for her. He was from a family of wealth and influence, and the prospect of their marriage was something both families desired. But as Peter droned on about his latest business venture, Emily found herself disengaged, her thoughts drifting back to that quiet evening on the beach with Dani. Peter, noticing her silence, smiled at her, mistaking her distraction for demure interest. "I was thinking we could spend a weekend at the family villa by the lake. It's very private. You'll love it," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. Emily forced a polite smile, but her heart wasn't in it. "That sounds lovely," she replied, though her mind was elsewhere. As the evening wore on, Emily excused herself from the table and stepped outside to the garden. She took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. The stars twinkled above her, but even their beauty couldn't lift the weight she felt pressing down on her chest. She knew what her parents wanted, what they expected, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she could give it to them. Meanwhile, Dani's life had continued on in its usual rhythm. He spent his days out at sea, the salty air and the sound of the waves his constant companions. His hands, calloused and strong from years of hard work, guided his fishing boat with precision. But even as he went about his daily routine, his thoughts kept wandering back to Emily. He tried to push the memory of her out of his mind. She was from a world so far removed from his own that it seemed foolish to think anything could ever happen between them. Still, he couldn't forget the way she had looked at him, the way she had confided in him, if only for a brief moment. One evening, as Dani was cleaning his boat at the dock, he noticed a familiar figure approaching. His heart gave a little jump when he realized it was Emily. She was dressed more casually this time, in a simple white dress that fluttered gently in the breeze. But even in her simplicity, she radiated elegance. Dani's brow furrowed slightly as she approached. He hadn't expected to see her again, and he wasn't sure what to make of her sudden appearance. "Emily," Dani greeted her, his voice low and steady, but there was a hint of surprise in his tone. "Dani," Emily replied, her voice soft, but there was a certain determination in her eyes. "I hope I'm not intruding." Dani shook his head, wiping his hands on a rag. "No, not at all. I just didn't expect to see you here." Emily smiled faintly, stepping closer to the boat. She ran her fingers along the edge of the wooden hull, feeling the worn, weathered surface beneath her fingertips. It was so different from anything she was used to, yet it felt strangely grounding. "I needed to get away for a bit," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is the only place I could think of." Dani studied her for a moment, noting the weariness in her eyes. He could sense that something was weighing heavily on her, though he didn't press for details. Instead, he motioned to the water. "It's peaceful out there. Helps clear your head." Emily nodded, gazing out at the calm, shimmering sea. "I envy that. I envy the simplicity of your life." Dani's eyebrows raised slightly. He had never considered his life to be something to envy. It was hard, exhausting work day in and day out. There was little room for luxury or leisure, but it was honest, and it was his. "You say that like it's a bad thing," Dani said, his tone light, but laced with curiosity. Emily sighed, crossing her arms over her chest as she leaned against the boat. "It's not. It's just different. My life, it's all about appearances. Parties, dinners, social obligations. It's all so exhausting, and none of it feels real. Sometimes I just want to escape it all." Dani watched her carefully. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the turmoil she was struggling to keep hidden behind her composed exterior. For a brief moment, he felt a pang of sympathy for her. She may have lived a life of luxury, but it was clear that it came with its own set of burdens. "Maybe you need to stop running away and start living for yourself," Dani said quietly, his words more of an observation than advice. Emily turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "And how do I do that? How do I just walk away from everything?" Dani shrugged, his gaze steady. "You don't have to walk away. You just have to decide what matters more, what other people expect from you, or what you want for yourself." His words hit Emily like a wave. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. So directly, so unapologetically. Everyone in her life was always so careful, always tiptoeing around the truth, never wanting to upset the balance of things. But Dani, He wasn't afraid to speak the truth, and it was both refreshing and terrifying. "I don't know if I can do that," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Dani looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening. "You'll figure it out. But don't wait too long. Life doesn't stop for anyone." There was a moment of silence between them, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the dock. Emily felt something stir within her, a longing for something more, something real. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she knew that Dani represented a kind of freedom she had never known before. As the evening grew darker, Dani offered to take her out on his boat. Hesitant at first, Emily eventually agreed, drawn by the idea of leaving the shore behind, even if only for a little while. As they drifted out into the open water, the wind ruffled Emily's hair, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. There was no pretense out here, no expectations. It was just her, Dani, and the endless expanse of the sea. They didn't talk much as the boat bobbed gently in the water, but the silence between them was comfortable, almost intimate. Emily found herself glancing over at Dani, watching the way his strong hands expertly guided the boat, his expression focused yet relaxed. There was something about him that put her at ease, something that made her feel like she didn't have to pretend to be someone she wasn't. As the moon rose high in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the water, Dani finally spoke. "You don't belong in my world, Emily." His words were blunt, but there was no malice in them, just a simple truth. Emily looked at him, her heart sinking slightly. "Maybe I don't, but I don't belong in mine either." Dani's gaze softened as he looked at her. He could see the sadness in her eyes, the weight of the life she had been born into pressing down on her. He wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between them. But in that moment, he realized that Emily wasn't just some spoiled rich girl. She was someone searching for something more, just like he was. They returned to the shore in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. As they reached the dock, Emily hesitated before stepping off the boat. She turned to face Dani, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dani nodded, his expression unreadable. "Anytime." As Emily walked away, she felt a strange sense of loss, as if leaving Dani behind meant leaving behind a part of herself. But she also knew that their worlds were too different, too far apart for anything to come of it. Yet, despite the distance between their lives, neither could shake the feeling that their paths were destined to cross again. And in that quiet, moonlit night, both Emily and Dani were left with the same lingering question. Could two people from such different worlds ever truly find a place together? As the days passed, Emily found it increasingly difficult to push Dani from her thoughts. Her heart was drawn to him in ways she couldn't quite understand or control, but her mind was a relentless voice of reason, reminding her of the chasm between their worlds. She spent her days in the opulent confines of her family's estate, where every inch screamed luxury, yet it all felt hollow. The lavish parties, the exclusive dinners, the carefully curated gatherings, it all felt like a gilded cage. Her life was dictated by expectations, from the way she dressed to the people she associated with, and Dani was a stark contradiction to that life. In the days following their moonlit boat ride, Emily retreated into the routines of her upper-crust existence, but her mind wandered. She kept replaying their moments together, the quiet strength in Dani's voice, the steadiness of his gaze, the way he treated her not as a delicate porcelain doll, but as someone with substance, someone who had worth beyond appearances. She hadn't felt that with anyone else, especially not with Peter, the man her parents were eager for her to marry. It wasn't just Dani's simplicity that captivated her. It was the way he seemed untouched by the expectations and demands of society. There was a rawness, a truth in him that Emily craved. In a world full of masks and pretense, Dani was genuine, and that terrified her as much as it thrilled her. It made her wonder if there could be more to her life than the carefully plotted future her family had in store. One afternoon, as Emily sat in the family's ornate library, leafing through a book she wasn't really reading, her mother, Victoria, entered the room. Victoria was every bit the picture of sophistication, tall, graceful, with a sharp gaze that seemed to miss nothing. She had a way of entering a room and commanding attention without even trying. "Emily, darling, I've just had the most delightful conversation with Peter's mother," Victoria began, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "They're hosting a charity gala this weekend. It's the perfect opportunity for you and Peter to be seen together. Everyone will be there." Emily's stomach tightened. It was the same routine over and over again. Appearances, performances, obligations. She knew exactly what her mother wanted. Emily and Peter, side by side, creating the image of a perfect union that would soon evolve into an engagement. But the thought of it made her feel trapped. "I'm not sure I'm feeling up to it," Emily said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the book in her lap. Victoria's smile faltered slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing as she approached her daughter. "Not feeling up to it?" she repeated, as if the concept was foreign to her. "Emily, darling, this is important. These events are crucial for maintaining our family standing. You know how much we've invested in building relationships with people like the Harrisons. This is not the time for personal whims." Emily bit her lip, feeling the weight of her mother's expectations pressing down on her. She had always been the obedient daughter, the one who did what was expected without complaint. But something inside her had shifted, something Dani had unknowingly awoken. She wanted more. She wanted a life that felt real, not just a series of scripted moments for the benefit of others. "I just don't think Peter and I are," Emily began, hesitating as she tried to find the right words. "I'm not sure we're right for each other." Victoria's gaze hardened. "Nonsense. Peter is perfect for you. He comes from a good family, he's successful, and he adores you. What more could you want?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain to her mother that what she wanted wasn't status or wealth, but something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster and her soul feel alive? How could she make her mother understand that she wanted more than just a carefully planned future? She wanted love, passion, and freedom. "I'll think about it," Emily said softly, not wanting to argue any further. Victoria gave her a tight smile, satisfied for now. "Good. I'll let Peter know that you'll be there." As soon as her mother left the room, Emily felt the walls closing in on her. She needed to get out, to breathe. Without thinking, she grabbed her bag and slipped out of the house, heading toward the only place that made sense to her anymore: the beach. The sun was beginning to set by the time Emily reached the familiar stretch of shoreline where she had first met Dani. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the air was warm and fragrant with the scent of salt water and distant flowers. She kicked off her shoes, letting her bare feet sink into the sand as she walked along the water's edge, feeling the cool waves lap against her ankles. For a while, she simply wandered, lost in thought, but eventually, she saw him. Dani was out on his boat, his silhouette dark against the setting sun as he hauled in the day's catch. Even from a distance, there was something mesmerizing about him. His strength, his purpose, his quiet confidence. Emily watched him for a moment before finally calling out, her voice soft, but carrying in the stillness of the evening. "Dani!" He looked up, his eyes immediately finding hers. For a brief moment, surprise flickered across his face, but then he smiled. A small, genuine smile that made Emily's heart skip a beat. "You're back," Dani said as he docked his boat, stepping onto the sand with practiced ease. "I couldn't stay away," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a moment of silence between them as Dani studied her, his eyes searching her face for answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes seemed to carry a sadness that didn't belong on someone so young and beautiful. "Rough day?" Dani asked gently. Emily nodded, her throat tightening as she tried to keep her emotions in check. "You could say that." Dani motioned toward the beach, and they began walking together side by side, their footsteps leaving a trail in the sand behind them. The silence between them was comfortable, almost soothing, and Emily found herself feeling more at ease than she had in days. "I feel like I'm living someone else's life," Emily said after a while, her voice trembling slightly. "Everything is planned out for me. Who I'm supposed to marry, what I'm supposed to do. how I'm supposed to act. It's like I don't even have a say in my own future." Dani didn't respond right away, letting her words hang in the air between them. He understood what she was saying, even though his life was the polar opposite of hers. He knew what it was like to feel trapped, to feel like your life wasn't entirely your own. But unlike Emily, he had found a way to carve out a life that felt true to him, even if it wasn't easy. "You have a say," Dani said quietly, his voice steady. "You just have to be willing to make the hard choices." Emily looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of her unspoken fears. "I don't know if I'm brave enough to do that." Dani stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "You're stronger than you think, Emily." There was something in the way he said her name, something that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt before. It was as if Dani wasn't just talking to her. He was speaking to the part of her that had been buried for so long, the part of her that yearned for more than just the life she had been given. Without thinking, Emily reached out and took Dani's hand, the warmth of his skin against hers sending a shiver through her body. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them, standing there on the beach, holding on to each other as if they were the only thing keeping the rest of the world at bay. "I don't know what to do," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I feel like I'm being pulled in two different directions, and I don't know which way to go." Dani's hand tightened around hers, his gaze never leaving her face. "Then follow your heart. It'll tell you where you need to be." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of her unspoken desires. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she could have the courage to follow her heart, even if it meant leaving behind everything she had ever known. But as much as she wanted to, she wasn't sure if she was ready. Not yet. Back in the mansion that night, Emily lay in bed, her mind racing. The walls of her bedroom, adorned with elegant tapestries and expensive paintings, suddenly felt too close, too suffocating. She thought of Dani, of his steady, calming presence, and how different her life felt when she was with him. He made her feel free, like she could be herself without the weight of expectations crushing her. But the reality of their worlds kept creeping in. Her family would never accept someone like Dani, and deep down, she wasn't sure she could walk away from the life she had always known. The conflict in her heart was almost unbearable. And so, she lay there, torn between two worlds, one of wealth and status, and the other of simplicity and true connection. And as the night wore on, Emily realized that no matter how hard she tried to avoid it, a choice was inevitable. The days following Emily's emotional confession on the beach seemed to stretch out endlessly. Each passing moment weighed heavily on her heart, torn between the world she had always known and the one she had tasted with Dani. On the surface, her life remained unchanged. She attended social gatherings with her family, engaged in idle conversations with Peter, and smiled politely at the endless barrage of questions from society about their impending engagement. But inside, Emily was unraveling. Her heart was no longer tethered to the carefully orchestrated plans of her parents. It belonged to Dani. Every stolen moment they had shared haunted her thoughts. The way his hand felt in hers, the sound of his voice telling her to follow her heart. But could she? Could she defy everything she had been raised to believe in? Could she risk losing her family, her status, and the comfortable life she had always known for a man who came from a world so different from her own? It was in the middle of this turmoil that Emily received an invitation from Peter's family for a weekend getaway to their country estate. Her mother had been thrilled, urging her to accept and cement her relationship with Peter, but Emily hesitated. The idea of spending a weekend playing the role of the perfect socialite, pretending to care about the trivial concerns of high society, felt suffocating. Yet, declining the invitation would only raise suspicions, especially from Peter. He had become increasingly insistent, pressing her to define the nature of their relationship. While Peter had always been polite and considerate, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being backed into a corner. She felt like a bird with clipped wings, trapped in a gilded cage, forced to sing a song that was not her own. In a moment of clarity, Emily realized she needed space. Time to think, to breathe, to escape the relentless pressure of her life. That's when she decided to visit Dani again. The next morning, Emily woke before dawn. The mansion was quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind against the curtains. She dressed quickly, slipping into simple clothes that allowed her to move freely. As she left the house, the first rays of sunlight were beginning to streak across the sky, painting the world in hues of soft pink and gold. The walk to the beach felt different this time, almost charged with a sense of urgency. Emily's heart raced with anticipation as she neared the shoreline, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Dani. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was a comforting rhythm, reminding her of the peace she felt whenever she was near him. As she reached the familiar stretch of sand, she spotted Dani's boat anchored offshore. Her pulse quickened, and before she could think twice, she called out his name. "Dani!" He turned at the sound of her voice, his expression softening into a smile as soon as he saw her. Dani quickly made his way toward her, his strong, sure strides cutting through the sand. As he reached her, there was a moment of silence between them, the unspoken connection they shared palpable in the air. "You came back," Dani said, his voice warm with quiet surprise. "I had to," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't stay away." Dani studied her for a moment, his eyes searching her face as if trying to understand the storm of emotions swirling within her. He could see the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Are you all right?" Dani asked gently. Emily shook her head, her throat tightening with emotion. "I don't know what to do anymore. Everything is falling apart." Dani stepped closer, his presence grounding her in a way that no one else could. "What's going on?" For a moment, Emily struggled to find the words. How could she explain the depth of her turmoil to someone whose life was so different from hers? But as she looked into Dani's eyes, she felt a sense of safety, a feeling that she could tell him anything. "They want me to marry Peter," she said finally, her voice cracking with the weight of the confession. "My parents have planned everything. They've made it clear that this is the path I'm supposed to follow, the life I'm supposed to lead. But I don't love him, Dani. I don't want that life." Dani's expression darkened slightly, though he tried to mask the pain in his eyes. He had known, from the moment he met Emily, that their worlds were light years apart. But hearing her say it aloud, hearing the pain in her voice as she spoke of a life she didn't want, it stirred something deep within him. "And what do you want, Emily?" Dani asked softly, his voice laced with tenderness. "What does your heart tell you?" Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she met his gaze. She knew the answer, but saying it out loud felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. "I want you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I want to be with you, Dani, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to walk away from everything else." Dani's breath hitched slightly, the depth of her words sinking in. He had tried to keep his distance, tried to remind himself that someone like Emily could never truly be a part of his world. But standing here, with her so close, the reality of their connection felt undeniable. "You're stronger than you think," Dani said quietly, echoing the words he had spoken on the beach that night. "But this isn't just about strength, Emily. It's about what you're willing to fight for." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, her heart torn in two. "I don't know if I can fight alone." "You're not alone," Dani replied, his hand reaching out to gently cup her cheek. "You'll never be alone, not as long as I'm here." For a long moment, they stood there, the tension between them thick and electric. The waves crashed against the shore, the sun climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows on the sand. Emily could feel the pull of Dani's presence, the way her body seemed to gravitate toward him as if they were two magnets destined to collide. But just as she began to lean into him, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. "Emily?" Both Emily and Dani turned to see Peter standing a few feet away, his expression a mix of confusion and anger. He had come looking for her, following her to the beach after growing suspicious of her absence that morning. And now, seeing her with Dani, it was clear that his suspicions had been confirmed. "Peter," Emily breathed, her heart sinking as guilt washed over her. What the hell is going on here? Peter demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. His eyes flicked between Emily and Dani, his jaw clenched tightly. Emily stepped back, her mind racing. How could she explain this? How could she make Peter understand something that she didn't fully understand herself? It's not what it looks like, Emily began, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Peter scoffed, his expression hardening. Really? Because it looks like you've been sneaking around with this fisherman while we're supposed to be planning our future together. Dani remained silent, his eyes fixed on Peter with a steady, unflinching gaze. He knew this confrontation was inevitable, but it didn't make it any easier to stomach. Peter, please, Emily pleaded, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for this to happen. Peter's face twisted with anger and hurt. Didn't mean for what to happen, Emily? Didn't mean to betray me? Didn't mean to fall for someone who has no place in your life? At that, Dani's expression darkened. He had always known he didn't belong in Emily's world, but hearing it spoken so callously ignited a flicker of anger within him. That's enough, Dani said quietly, his voice low but firm. Peter turned to him, his eyes blazing with fury. You don't get to tell me what's enough. You don't belong here, in her life, in her world. You're nothing. The words stung, but Dani refused to let them show. He knew who he was, and he wouldn't let Peter's condescension shake him. Emily, meanwhile, was trembling with the weight of the confrontation. She could feel the walls closing in, the two halves of her life crashing together in a violent collision. It was everything she had feared, and yet she couldn't deny the truth any longer. Peter, I'm sorry, Emily said softly, her voice breaking. But I can't marry you. I can't live a life that doesn't feel like mine. Peter stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. You're really choosing him? Over me? Over everything we've built? Tears welled in Emily's eyes, and she shook her head. I'm not choosing him over you, Peter. I'm choosing myself. I'm choosing what feels right. Peter's face hardened, his features contorting with rage. You'll regret this, Emily. You'll regret throwing away everything for some fleeting fantasy. With that, he turned and stormed off, leaving Emily standing there, her heart heavy with the weight of the confrontation. Dani watched him go, his jaw clenched, but his focus soon returned to Emily. She was shaking, her tears falling freely now as the reality of what had just happened sunk in. I didn't want it to end like this, Emily whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Dani stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently take hers. Sometimes, the only way to start something new is to let go of the old. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to lean into him, finding solace in his strength. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was walking it on her own terms. The days following Emily's decision to break things off with Peter were a whirlwind of emotions. Her heart felt lighter, but her mind was in chaos. She had officially severed ties with the life she had known, stepping out of the confines of the world that had shaped her entire existence. There was no going back now. Her family, her status, her future as a socialite, everything had been jeopardized by her choice to follow her heart. Emily spent hours in the quiet corners of the house, reflecting on what she had done. The mansion, which had once felt like a palace of comfort and privilege, now felt cold and imposing. Her parents, sensing something had shifted, had yet to confront her directly, but she knew the storm was coming. It was only a matter of time before they learned the truth, that she had broken off her engagement with Peter, the man they had long planned for her to marry. The tension in the air was thick, palpable. Emily avoided family meals, choosing instead to take her meals alone in her room or outside, away from the watchful eyes of her parents and the household staff. She couldn't bear the questions, the disappointment that was surely brewing behind her parents' well-rehearsed smiles. One afternoon, as she sat by the window, her fingers lightly tracing the delicate patterns on the glass, her mother appeared at her bedroom door. Dressed impeccably in an elegant gown, her face was a mask of composure, but her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. Emily felt her stomach tighten in anticipation. "Emily," her mother said, her voice smooth but with an undercurrent of tension. "We need to talk." Emily nodded, silently inviting her mother to enter the room. Her mother's heels clicked softly against the wooden floor as she approached, her movements graceful, deliberate. "I've noticed you've been distant lately," her mother began, her eyes narrowing as she studied Emily's face. "And I'm sure you know that Peter has been in touch with us." Emily's heart sank. She had been dreading this conversation, knowing that Peter would have reached out to her parents after their confrontation on the beach. She could only imagine the version of events he had shared with them, the way he had painted Dani as an intruder in their carefully constructed world. "I ended things with Peter," Emily said softly, bracing herself for the inevitable fallout. Her mother's expression barely wavered, but there was a sharpness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "Ended things?" she repeated, her voice deceptively calm. "What do you mean by that, Emily?" Emily took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "I told him I couldn't marry him. I told him that it wasn't right, that I wasn't in love with him." There was a long, suffocating silence. Her mother stood there, her lips pressed into a thin line, her perfectly manicured hands clasped tightly in front of her. "And why is that, Emily?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is there someone else?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Emily knew she couldn't lie. Not now. The truth was already out there, and denying it would only make things worse. "Yes," Emily admitted, her voice trembling. "There is someone else." Her mother's eyes widened slightly, the flicker of shock quickly replaced by a steely resolve. "Who?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Who is this man?" Emily hesitated, knowing that revealing Dani's identity would only deepen the chasm between her and her family. But she couldn't hide the truth any longer. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it. "His name is Dani," Emily said quietly. "He's a fisherman." Her mother recoiled slightly, as if the very word fisherman was something distasteful. "A fisherman?" she repeated, her tone laced with incredulity. "Emily, do you have any idea what you're doing? What this could mean for our family?" "I know what I'm doing," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I'm following my heart." Her mother's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing with cold determination. "Your heart? Emily, you're not some naive girl who can afford to throw away her future on a whim. You're a Davenport, and with that name comes responsibility. This fisherman has no place in your life. He has no future with you." Emily's heart clenched at her mother's words, but she refused to back down. "I don't care about status or wealth, Mother. I care about being happy. I care about being with someone who understands me, who sees me for who I really am." Her mother's eyes blazed with fury. "This is madness, Emily. Do you have any idea what you're saying? You are throwing away everything for what? A fleeting infatuation with some commoner." "It's not infatuation," Emily replied, her voice rising slightly. "I love him." The words echoed in the room, startling even Emily with their intensity. It was the first time she had said it out loud, the first time she had truly admitted to herself how deeply she felt for Dani. Her mother's face twisted with anger and disbelief. "Love? You don't even know what love is, Emily. You've been coddled your entire life, sheltered from the realities of the world. This fisherman is taking advantage of your naivety. You can't possibly think that a life with him would bring you anything but hardship." Emily stood her ground, her eyes locked on her mother's. "I don't care about hardship. I care about being true to myself." Her mother's composure cracked, her voice rising in frustration. "Emily, you are making a terrible mistake. You cannot throw away your future for some foolish notion of love. What about Peter? What about the life we've built for you?" "I don't want that life," Emily cried, her voice breaking with the weight of her emotions. "I don't want to be trapped in a gilded cage, living a life that isn't mine. I want to be free. I want to be with Dani." Her mother stared at her, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice low and icy. "If you walk away from this family, if you choose this man over everything we have given you, then you will no longer be a Davenport. You will be on your own." The words hit Emily like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She had known, deep down, that this was coming, that her decision to be with Dani would come at a steep cost. But hearing her mother say it aloud, hearing the finality in her voice, made it all the more real. "I understand," Emily said quietly, her heart heavy with the weight of her choice. Her mother's eyes flashed with cold fury. "Then so be it. If you want to throw away your life for this man, then I will not stop you. But do not come crawling back when you realize the mistake you've made." With that, her mother turned and stormed out of the room, leaving Emily standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. The door closed with a sharp click, and the room was suddenly quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind outside. Emily sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. She had known that choosing Dani would mean losing her family, but the reality of it hit her harder than she had anticipated. She had always been close to her parents, particularly her mother, and the thought of being disowned, of losing the life she had always known, was overwhelming. But as the weight of her decision settled over her, Emily felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in her life, she had stood up for herself, had chosen her own path instead of following the one laid out for her. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating. Later that evening, Emily found herself walking along the beach once again, the familiar sound of the waves crashing against the shore bringing her a sense of calm. The sky was a deep, velvety blue, the stars twinkling overhead like tiny diamonds. The air was cool and salty, the breeze gentle against her skin. As she walked, her thoughts drifted to Dani. She hadn't seen him since their confrontation with Peter on the beach, and part of her worried that the intensity of that moment had scared him off. But another part of her knew Dani better than that. He wasn't the kind of man to run away from a challenge. Sure enough, as she rounded the corner of the beach, she spotted him sitting on a large rock near the water, his silhouette dark against the fading light. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Dani," Emily called softly, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the waves. Dani turned at the sound of her voice, his expression softening when he saw her. He stood up, brushing the sand off his hands as he approached her. "I was starting to think you weren't going to come," Dani said, his voice gentle but laced with concern. Emily shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I wouldn't leave without saying goodbye." Dani's brow furrowed, his eyes searching her face. "Goodbye?" Emily sighed, her heart heavy. "I told my parents about us. My mother, she said that if I chose you, I would be cut off from the family." Dani's face tensed, his jaw clenching. "And what did you say?" "I said I wanted to be with you," Emily replied, her voice firm. Dani stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with emotion. In the weeks that followed her confrontation with her mother, Emily found herself navigating the complexities of life away from her family. The house, once a haven of security, had become a symbol of everything she had left behind. Despite the weight of her choice, she felt a sense of freedom she had never experienced before. Yet, with that freedom came uncertainty, particularly in her relationship with Dani. After revealing her feelings and the consequences of her choice to him, Dani was initially ecstatic. He embraced her fiercely, wrapping her in his strong arms as if to shield her from the world. But even in those moments of bliss, Emily could see the shadow of doubt creeping into his eyes. She sensed that beneath his outward strength lay a fear of inadequacy, of not being enough for her. As days turned into weeks, the reality of Emily's decision began to settle in. The world outside her family's mansion was both exhilarating and intimidating. She spent more time with Dani, often accompanying him on his fishing trips and exploring the vibrant life of the small coastal town they called home. The sun-kissed beaches, the salty air, and the camaraderie of the local fishermen enveloped her like a warm embrace. Yet, the luxury she had taken for granted began to feel like a distant memory. She realized that the life she had chosen was filled with its own set of challenges. Dani's work was grueling. Long hours at sea left him physically exhausted, and many nights, he returned home with little more than a handful of fish. Emily quickly learned that their life would not be as glamorous as the one she had left behind. One evening, as they prepared dinner together in Dani's modest kitchen, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. She watched as Dani filleted the fish with deft hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strength and determination that had drawn her to him. "Dani," she began hesitantly, breaking the comfortable silence that had enveloped them. "Are you happy? I mean, with us?" Dani paused, his knife hovering over the fish as he processed her question. "Of course I am, Em. You know that. But do you ever think about, the future?" She pressed, her heart racing. "What happens next?" He looked up, his dark eyes piercing hers with intensity. "Every day. But I can't promise you a life of luxury, Emily. I can promise you love, but I can't give you a mansion or fancy cars." Emily felt a pang of guilt wash over her. "I don't need any of that. I chose you for you, not for the life I left behind. But I can't shake the feeling that I'm holding you back. Maybe you deserve someone who fits in your world better." Dani set down the knife, stepping closer to her, his expression serious. "You're not holding me back. You are my world, Emily. This life may be tough, but it's worth it with you by my side. Don't doubt that." Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes as she felt the weight of his words settle in her heart. But deep down, she still felt the ghost of her old life haunting her. The stark contrast between Dani's humble existence and her family's affluent lifestyle weighed heavily on her mind. As the days turned into weeks, Emily began to feel the strain of her decision. She wanted to support Dani, to immerse herself fully in this new life, but the differences loomed large. Each time she returned home to her small apartment, she was reminded of the luxuries she had abandoned. She longed for the easy camaraderie of her past life, for the laughter shared over extravagant dinners and the sparkle of champagne toasts. Yet in that world, she had felt stifled and suffocated. One night, as they sat on the beach watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily felt a sense of foreboding. The vibrant colors of the sunset seemed to mirror her inner turmoil, beautiful yet fleeting. She turned to Dani, who was staring at the ocean, lost in thought. "Dani, do you ever wish you had more? A bigger boat? A nicer place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dani's gaze shifted from the horizon to her, surprise flickering across his features. "Sometimes, sure, but then I think about what I have right now. I have you, and that's enough for me. But I don't want you to settle," Emily replied, her heart aching with the weight of their conversation. "I want you to be happy. I want us to have a future that's more than just this." Dani chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're worrying too much. Life isn't about the things we have. It's about the people we share it with. You and I are building something special. That's what matters." As the words left his mouth, Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. Dani was right. What they had was special. It was raw and real, something she had never experienced in her previous life of privilege. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on a precipice, teetering between love and the harsh realities of their world. As the weeks rolled on, the pressure of her choice continued to mount. Emily became more involved in Dani's life, helping out at the local fish market, learning how to cook traditional dishes, and even trying her hand at fishing. Yet, every time she saw the disappointment in her parents' eyes during their occasional phone calls, her heart would break a little more. The love and pride they had once had for her were now tinged with disappointment and disbelief. One day, Emily decided to take a leap of faith and invite her parents for dinner at Dani's home. She hoped that introducing them to him and his world would help them understand the depth of her feelings. With Dani's encouragement, she planned a simple yet heartfelt meal, a feast of freshly caught fish, paired with her favorite homemade side dishes. She wanted them to see Dani for who he was, not just as a fisherman, but as a man who had stolen her heart. The night of the dinner arrived, and Emily's nerves were at an all-time high. She had set the table with a mixture of flowers and seashells, an ode to the life she was beginning to cherish. As the clock ticked closer to her parents' arrival, her heart raced with anticipation and anxiety. When her parents arrived, the tension was palpable. They stepped into the small, cozy home, their expressions a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Dani greeted them warmly, offering them drinks and making small talk, but Emily could see the unease lingering in their eyes. "Thank you for coming," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wanted you to see where I've been living with Dani." Her father's gaze swept the room, taking in the modest decor and the simplicity of their surroundings. "It's quaint," he commented, his tone devoid of warmth. Emily felt her heart sink, but pressed on. "I know it's different from what you're used to, but I'm happy here. Dani makes me happy." Her mother exchanged a glance with her father, and Emily could feel the weight of their judgment hanging in the air. "But this isn't how you were raised, Emily," her mother said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You deserve so much more than this." "No, Mom," Emily replied firmly. "I deserve to be happy, and that's not determined by the size of my home or the amount of money I have. It's about the love we share." Dinner began, and despite her best efforts, the atmosphere remained tense. Her parents picked at their food, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. Emily tried to engage them in conversation about the town, the fish market, and the beauty of the ocean, but their responses were lukewarm at best. Dani, sensing her discomfort, remained attentive, his gaze shifting between her and her parents, trying to bridge the gap that seemed to widen with each passing moment. After dinner, Emily excused herself to the kitchen, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She needed a moment to collect herself. As she rinsed the dishes, she heard Dani enter the kitchen, his presence a comforting balm amidst the tension. "How did it go?" he asked softly, leaning against the counter beside her. Emily sighed, her heart heavy. "I don't think they'll ever understand, will they?" Dani shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "They'll come around, Em. It just takes time. You're making a big choice, and they might need time to adjust. I just wanted them to see how happy you make me," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted them to see the real you, not just the fisherman they've conjured in their minds." "Love isn't always easy," Dani replied, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "But it's worth fighting for. We'll figure this out together." Just then, her parents appeared at the doorway, their expressions serious. Emily felt her heart race as she braced herself for what was coming next. "We need to talk," her father said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "About what?" Emily asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother stepped forward, her expression softening slightly. "Emily, we want what's best for you, but we're worried. This isn't the life we envisioned for you." "I know," Emily replied, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "But this is my life now. I'm not going back." Her father shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. "You're throwing everything away for a life that's uncertain. You could have so much more." "Dad, I don't want more. I want this," Emily insisted, her voice rising with passion. "I want Dani." The silence that followed was deafening. Dani stood beside her, his presence a steady anchor as Emily faced the storm brewing in her parents' eyes. "Emily," her mother said softly, "please think about your future. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about what happens next." Emily took a deep breath, drawing strength from the love she felt for Dani. The days that followed the dinner with Emily's parents felt like a whirlwind. Each morning greeted Emily with the soft sound of waves lapping at the shore, a gentle reminder of the life she had chosen beside Dani. Yet, with each sunrise, the weight of uncertainty lingered in the air like a thick fog. Emily found herself caught between the remnants of her past and the promise of her future. Dani, ever the supportive partner, continued to encourage her to pursue her passions. He introduced her to the local community, fishermen, shop owners, and families who had lived by the sea for generations. Slowly but surely, Emily began to find her footing in this new world, immersing herself in the rhythm of island life. However, despite the beauty that surrounded her, the emotional strain of her family's disapproval cast a long shadow over her happiness. One day, as they strolled along the beach after a long day of fishing, Emily turned to Dani, her heart heavy. "Dani, do you think I made the right choice? Leaving my family behind to be with you." Dani stopped and faced her, the golden rays of the setting sun illuminating his features. "Emily, you followed your heart. That takes strength. Sometimes, love means making difficult choices. I just wish it didn't hurt so much, she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. Dani stepped closer, wiping her tears with his thumb. Love is a journey, and every journey has its bumps. We'll get through this together, I promise. With a small smile, Emily nodded, feeling a flicker of hope rekindle in her chest. As they walked, hand in hand, the sky shifted from vibrant oranges to deep purples, and the stars began to twinkle overhead like diamonds scattered across velvet. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still beauty to be found. The following weeks were a testament to their resilience. Emily threw herself into her new life, volunteering at a local shelter, helping to organize community events, and even starting a small cooking class to teach the traditional recipes she had grown up with. Her passion for cooking brought people together, and soon, the little class became a weekly gathering for locals and newcomers alike. One evening, as she prepared for her cooking class, Dani entered the kitchen, a smile brightening his face. "You're going to be the star of the show tonight," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Emily chuckled, her heart warming at his enthusiasm. "I just hope everyone enjoys the dishes." "They will. You've put your heart into this, and that's what matters," he replied, stepping forward to help her chop vegetables. "Plus, I might have slipped a few extra fish in for you." Emily laughed, shaking her head. "You can't keep stealing from the catch of the day, you know." "Hey, I'm just making sure my girlfriend impresses everyone," he teased, and the banter between them felt like a gentle balm to her worries. As the sun began to set, painting the kitchen in warm, golden hues, the sound of laughter and chatter filled the air. Neighbors and friends gathered in the cozy space, excited for an evening of food, stories, and connection. Emily felt a sense of belonging growing within her as she served her first dish, a savory seafood stew that reminded her of family gatherings back home. As they enjoyed the meal together, Emily shared stories of her upbringing, her mother's exquisite cooking, and the lavish parties she used to attend. She could see the fascination in her audience's eyes, and as she spoke, a sense of nostalgia washed over her. For the first time since leaving her family, she felt a deep connection to the people around her. They laughed, reminiscing about their own traditions, and a warmth filled the room that transcended her past. After dinner, the atmosphere shifted slightly. One of the attendees, a woman named Maria, leaned closer to Emily, her voice lowered. "How do you handle the distance from your family?" "I can't imagine being away from mine." Emily paused, her heart tightening. "It's difficult. Some days are easier than others. But I'm learning that family can also be the people you choose to surround yourself with." Dani stood nearby, his eyes filled with pride as he watched Emily embrace her new life. He stepped forward, joining the conversation. "What matters is that you've built a community here. These people support you, just like families should." Maria nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're right. It's about finding those who uplift you, even if they're not related by blood." As the evening progressed, the conversations deepened, and Emily felt a sense of liberation in sharing her experiences. By the end of the night, laughter echoed around the room, and Dani's hand in hers felt like a constant reminder that she was exactly where she was meant to be. However, the euphoria of the evening was short-lived. The next morning, Emily received an unexpected phone call from her mother. The familiar sound of her voice sent a wave of anxiety crashing over her. "Emily, we need to talk," her mother said, her tone clipped. Emily's heart raced. "Mom, is everything okay? It's about your father. He's been unwell. He wants to see you," her mother said, her voice wavering slightly. A torrent of emotions washed over Emily, fear, guilt, and a deep-seated longing for her family. "I'll come home," she said, the words tumbling out before she could think them through. "Don't bring Dani," her mother added sharply. "This is family business." Emily felt her chest tighten. "Mom, I can't just leave him behind. He's part of my life now. We'll discuss this when you arrive," her mother replied, ending the call. The weight of the world settled heavily on Emily's shoulders. She felt torn between her love for Dani and the pull of her family. When she shared the news with him later that day, his expression darkened, a flicker of hurt crossing his face. "Are you really going back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have to, Dani. My dad is sick, and I can't ignore that," Emily replied, her heart aching at the thought of leaving him. Dani crossed his arms, his expression conflicted. "But what about us? What if they don't accept me? What if this is it for us?" Emily reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I don't want this to be the end. I love you, but I need to see my family. I owe them that much." Dani's jaw clenched, and Emily could see the turmoil in his eyes. "Promise me you won't forget what we have. Promise me you'll fight for us." "Of course, I will," she assured him, her voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling within her. "But I need to do this." That night, as Emily packed her bags, she felt a whirlwind of emotions: anticipation, fear, and a deep longing for connection. She couldn't shake the worry that her family's disapproval might taint the love she had found with Dani. The following morning, she boarded the plane back to her hometown, the familiar landscape of her past rushing past her window. Memories flooded her mind. Sunny days spent with her family, laughter around the dinner table, and the weight of expectations that had once felt so suffocating. As she arrived at her childhood home, the familiar scents and sights enveloped her like a warm embrace. But the reality of her choice loomed over her like a storm cloud. She stepped into the house, her heart racing, and was greeted by her mother's concerned gaze. "Emily," her mother said, her voice laced with worry, "your father is in the living room." Taking a deep breath, Emily walked toward the living room, her heart pounding. As she entered, she found her father sitting on the couch, looking frilier than she remembered. His face lit up at the sight of her, and for a moment, all the tension melted away. "Emily, my girl," he said, his voice shaky but warm. "I'm so glad you're here." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she rushed to his side, enveloping him in a tight embrace. "I missed you, Dad. I missed you too, sweetheart," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for everything. I just wanted what was best for you." The weight of unspoken words hung in the air as they shared a moment of understanding. Emily pulled back, looking into her father's eyes. "I know you want what's best for me, but I need you to understand that I'm happy with Dani. He makes me feel alive." Her father's expression softened, and he nodded slowly. "I've heard a lot about him. Your mother has been less than enthusiastic." Emily turned to her mother, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Mom, I love him. He's not just a fisherman. He's my partner, my support. I just worry you're throwing your future away," her mother interjected, her voice trembling. "I'm building my future with him," Emily asserted, her voice unwavering. "It may not look like what you envisioned, but it's real and it's mine." The conversation continued, filled with tension, but also moments of vulnerability and understanding. As they spoke, Emily felt a flicker of hope that perhaps with time, her family might come to accept her choice. That night, as she lay in the familiar comfort of her childhood room, Emily's mind raced with thoughts of Dani. She missed him more than she could express. The warmth of his embrace lingered in her memory, a constant reminder of the love they shared. The following days were a blur of hospital visits, conversations filled with heartfelt laughter, and moments of reflection. Emily's father shared stories of his youth, his eyes sparkling with nostalgia. And in those moments, the distance that had once seemed insurmountable began to fade. As Emily prepared to leave, her father pulled her aside, his voice earnest. "I may not understand your choices completely, but I want you to be happy, Emily. That's all I ever wanted." Tears pricked at her eyes as she embraced him once more. "Thank you, Dad. That means the world to me." As she made her way back to the airport, Emily felt a sense of closure settling within her. She had faced the storm, confronted her fears, and ultimately found a path forward, a path that would allow her to embrace both her love for Dani and her connection to her family. When she finally returned to the island, the familiar scent of salt water filled her lungs, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore felt like a welcome homecoming. Dani was waiting for her at the beach, his expression a mix of relief and worry. "Emily," he called, running toward her. As he enveloped her in a warm embrace, she felt a rush of happiness wash over her. "I was so worried. "I missed you so much," she replied, pulling back to look into his eyes. "You won't believe what happened." As they walked hand in hand along the shoreline, Emily shared her experiences, the heartfelt conversations, and the newfound understanding with her parents. Dani listened intently, pride and love radiating from him. "See? You faced it all," he said softly. "You showed them how strong you are. Together, we can face anything," Emily replied, her heart swelling with love. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the beach. In that moment, as the stars began to twinkle above, Emily knew that she had embarked on a journey that was uniquely hers, a journey of love, acceptance, and the courage to embrace both her past and her future. And as she stood there with Dani, she realized that their love was a force strong enough to weather any storm, guiding them through the challenges that lay ahead. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.